Hello everybody, this is Stephen Haas, and welcome to my presentation for the 2012 Electoral College Analysis. I did this a few years ago, got quite a number of hits, so I am going to try to do one again. I did this in 2008, but for 2012, we have one of the same candidates, of course Barack Obama. We have a different Republican candidate, but in any case, what I'm going to do is not try to tell you who I'm going to win, and especially I'm not going to tell you who I think you should vote for one way or the other. That's not the point. What I want to do is do a little bit of analysis of what are some of the key states and what are some of the key demographics that are going to play a big part in this year's 2012 presidential election. Today is June 10th of the year 2012, so there is still quite a bit of time until Election Day. In fact, the election season is just barely getting underway now. You'll start seeing the heavy advertising and the heavy campaigning once the days get hot and it starts getting into summer. And then, of course, as the days cool down a little bit and it gets after Labor Day and into the fall, then that will really be the stretch run. But before we even start all that, let's give you a little bit of a background as to how this year's presidential election will run. These are, of course, the two candidates. Mitt Romney, the challenger from, originally from Michigan by way of Massachusetts, served as the governor of Massachusetts from 2002 to 2006. He is the presumptive Republican nomination. And, of course, the presumptive Democratic nomination is President Barack Obama. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the United States presidential election system, I will go over it in a little bit of detail. I'm not going to go over it in a tremendous amount of detail, but instead we do not have in the United States direct presidential elections, which means we don't just count up the votes and declare the winner. Instead, we have what is called an electoral college system. You don't actually vote for the president or the challenger. You actually vote for an elector who is then going to turn around and cast his or her votes for a presidential candidate. Now, the historical reasons for this are varied and beyond the scope of really this presentation. Suffice it to say that it is established by the United States Constitution, and because of that has not been changed since it was established around 2¼ centuries ago, and is unlikely to be challenged anytime in the near future, although there are plenty of people who think that we should do away with the Electoral College system. Now, the way our system works is we have an electoral college system in which each state is allocated a certain number of electors. The number of electors that a particular state has is equal to the number of senators of that state plus the number of representatives from that state. Of course, the Senate is to a state, so every state has two. The representatives run from as few as 1 to as many as 53. So, and in addition to the various states, there are 3 electoral college votes that are allocated to the District of Columbia. Even though it does not have senators or representatives, it is not actually represented in Congress. By constitutional amendment, the District of Columbia also gets 3. Some states have as few as 3, as I mentioned. There are a whole bunch of states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, Vermont, and a few others. And then, of course, there are larger states. California has the most with 55 electoral college votes altogether. Other big states include Texas, New York, Florida, and of course there are many medium states and of course many smaller states. But the key thing that regards the electoral college votes is, number one, that most states are winner-take-all. In most states, if you win the state by 1 vote, you win the entire state. You win all the electoral college votes for that state. Florida, for example, in the famous election of the year 2000, when in a strange twist, Vice President Gore actually won more popular votes than Governor George W. Bush, but President Bush won then Governor Bush won the election. And the way he did it, essentially the tipping point state, the state that we all waited over a month to find out who was going to win, was Florida. And Florida was won only by under 600 votes. In a state with over 10 million, I guess about 10 million votes cast, less than 600 votes separated Gore from Bush, and the eventual margin in that state was extremely small, and nevertheless all 25 electoral college votes from the state of Florida went to Bush, helping to swing the election to him. The opposite almost happened in the year 2004. In 2004, President Bush defeated John Kerry and had a significant lead in the popular vote, about a 3% lead in 3% win in the popular vote. And nevertheless, if certain states would have flipped, for example, Ohio, which was decided by under 2%, would have gone to Kerry, then Kerry would have won the election, even despite losing the popular vote by a fairly significant margin. So the key number is 538. You have 538 total electoral college votes because there are 535 members of Congress, 100 senators and 435 representatives, and then you have the 3 from the District of Columbia. And because of that, you need 270 to win. In other words, you need a majority of the 538, which is 270. Now, if there is no majority, then it goes to the House of Representatives, who elects the president based on state delegations, but that's really a little bit beyond the scope of what I wanted to discuss today. So that 270 is, of course, the magic number. And the 270 will be based on the number of states, of course, or the number of big states, the number of electoral college votes that each candidate wins. Before we actually go ahead and look at the states, I'm going to take you through a map of the U.S. and try to give you a little bit of an idea of what I think the key states will be. The first thing that I want to do is take a look at some of the key demographics in the United States. Now, obviously, there are many, many, many different groups that vote and play an important political role in American politics. But there are a few key demographics that I think you have to watch when you're talking about a presidential election. Probably the 5 biggest demographic that exists in the American electorate. And those are the demographic of the African American vote, what I call the coastal liberal white vote. Coastal because they tend to be more towards the coast. These were usually referring to academics, maybe people who have a little bit more of a liberal outlook and academic outlook, not necessarily business people who may be a little bit maybe may identify with a different class of politics, but certainly the quote-unquote coastal liberal whites represent a very important demographic. You have Latinos, of course, a very, very important graphic, a swing demographic, demographic that's very important for both parties to capture if they want to win the White House. The working class whites demographic, which traditionally identified a little bit more with the Democratic Party, but recently that's kind of swung a little bit. And then you have the evangelical Christian demographic, which tends to vote very heavily Republican. I put all of these starting from the group most likely to vote for President Obama, ending with the group most likely to be voting for Governor Romney. And I put, again, in different shades of purple. The red, of course, for Republican red, the blue, of course, for Democrat blue, and for the others, kind of in purplish shades. Now, these demographics are very big, but not necessarily swing demographics. African Americans will vote maybe, 95%, 96%, maybe 94%, whatever it is for President Obama. So for a group like that, you're talking about turnout being key. Obviously, President Obama wants the turnout of African Americans to be very high. Governor Romney wants the turnout of African Americans to be very low. Evangelical Christians, of course, will be the opposite. Now, Romney's not going to get 95% of evangelical Christians, but he will get a very significant percentage. The coastal liberal whites will vote heavily for President Obama, but maybe not quite as much as 95%, but certainly in very significant numbers. This is a group that President Obama wants turnout to be very high. Governor Romney would like to try to keep the turnout as low as possible. Working class whites, kind of in the middle, and Latinos also, both swing demographics. Latinos usually vote for the Democratic, tend to lean Democratic, but still there can be an enormous swing. Governor Romney might be able to win 45% of the Latino vote, or he might win 25% of the Latino vote, really depending on how the campaign goes. So it's a swing demographic, as are working class whites also can be a very strong swing demographic. People who very often identify with the Republican Party in social issues may identify more with the Democratic Party in terms of economic issues. So these are the swing demographics that really either party can make a lot of headway in. So when I go through each state, I want to discuss a little bit about how those states are composed. Again, there are many other demographics that exist in the United States in much smaller levels and may be important in some states, but I want to focus on these demographics because this is really where the election is going to be decided. For the demographics on your side, you want turnout as high as possible. For the demographics in the middle, you want to take as much of the vote of that demographic as possible. And for the demographics on the other side, you want to try to depress turnout however you can. Now, also, I want to turn that on its side a little bit and look at the various states in the country and determine there are really three types of states that exist when it comes to American electoral politics. The first are the safe states. Those are the states that are virtually certainly going to go for one party or another. And if they don't, that means the election is a landslide anyway. So, for example, if you have a state like Texas, now it's possible for Texas to go for a Democrat, but if Texas I mean, it happened in 1964, but if Texas is even competitive, it means the Democratic Party has won the election anyway. The opposite is true for New York. It's possible for New York to go, even though New York is considered a safe Democratic state, it's possible for New York to vote for a Republican candidate. It happened in 1984, happened in 1972, but again, if New York casts its electoral votes for a Republican candidate, that means the election isn't competitive. In fact, if New York is competitive, it means the election is not competitive. So while these can cross over, they're pretty much non-factors in electoral politics. They're generally ignored by the candidates. There may be some token ads that are run in these states, especially if they have media markets that reach other states. New York City, there might be ads run because those ads may reach New Jersey and Pennsylvania, which are a little bit more swing states. But by and large, you're not going to see heavy blitzes of advertisements in states like Texas and New York because both candidates and their staffs know pretty much that those states are pretty much irrelevant. Then there are the leaning states. The leaning states are susceptible, generally lean to one party or another, but are susceptible to being changed. These states probably will not be competitive in a close race. If the race is very close, these states will shift toward one candidate or another. However, if one side takes a lead, a significant lead, then that could throw some of the leaning states in play. Very often in elections, some of the leaning states do become factors when one party starts to take the lead. Just for examples of leaning states, I put New Jersey, which generally tends to lean Democrat, and Indiana, which generally tends to lean Republican. In fact, I intentionally chose a state that President Obama won last time. Indiana was won by President Obama, just to illustrate the fact that Indiana, although in a very, very close election, like 2000 or 2004, it would be pretty safely in the Republican column. When the Democrat does well, a state like Indiana might become in play, might become a swing state. And in fact, President Obama was actually able to win Indiana. But again, these are still really kind of safe for the candidates to ignore because they cannot be a quote-unquote tipping point state. A tipping point state means the state that could make the difference. Ohio in 2004, Florida in 2000. These are states that can literally make the difference between winning or losing. These states are not going to be tipping point states. In the case of New Jersey, if New Jersey's close, it means the Republican has won anyway. If Indiana's close, it means the Democrat has won anyway. Therefore, these states don't really either get that much attention from the candidates. What do get attention from the candidates are the swing states. The swing states are the potential tipping point states, the states that can be that state. That means the difference between winning and losing. Now, of course, there are some states that are more swing than others. There are swing states that tilt a little Republican, then there are swing states that tilt a little Democrat, and then there are states that are really right in the middle, real tipping point states. A swing state that tilts a little Republican might be Virginia. A swing state that tilts a little Democrat might be Pennsylvania. Those states can be tipping point states, but are fairly unlikely to be. It's most likely that if there is going to be a very, very close election, that a state right in the middle will be the tipping point state. A state like Colorado, or a state like Ohio, or a state like Florida, even Wisconsin perhaps. But all the swing states, all those states in that middle group, are states that get enormous amount of advertising and campaigning from the various candidates. And in fact, this I have to credit Nate Silver of 538.com, or it's actually a New York Times blog now, called and Nate Silver a few weeks ago wrote a very interesting column on the difference between different types of swing states. There are really two different types of swing states. There are swing states that are close because there are very few swing voters, but both bases are really big. So let's say, for example, Virginia. Virginia has, roughly equal voting. I mean, certainly President Obama won Virginia fairly comfortably in 2008. Before that, President Bush had won it twice. But you can see from Virginia has been a swing state in gubernatorial elections and senatorial elections, with Jim Webb winning in 2006 and the Republicans doing very well in Virginia in 2010. You can see Virginia's recent status as a swing state, but that's not because there are a tremendous number of undecideds in Virginia. It's because Virginia has a very strong Republican population in, more southern. It has characteristics of a southern state very often, and has many Republican base voters, but it also has a large African American population and a large, quote unquote, coastal liberal white population in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Then you have other states that are swing voters, not necessarily because they have enormous bases of both, but because there are many voters themselves that change. Generally, this is true when you have states with many independent voters. The classic example there is New Hampshire, which can be a swing state. Clearly, President Obama won it fairly comfortably in 2008, but in 2002 2000 and 2004 was actually one of the few states to split its votes in 2000 and 2004, having cast its ballot for President Bush in 2000 and Senator Kerry in 2004. But a state like New Hampshire does have a lot of independent voters and therefore can swing from one party to the other based on that. And those two types of states have to be treated differently. A swing state that has roughly equal bases and fewer swing voters, turnout becomes very important. Whichever base gets the stronger turnout is going to win the state. On the other hand, you have a state like New Hampshire, it's really more about the message. If you can try to convince the independents to vote for you, that is what is going to help you win the state.
And now we're going to switch gears and focus on a map of the United States. This comes from Real Clear Politics, so thank you very much for lending me this map. And this is a map of the United States with all 50 states in gray, which means not predicted to go either way. And I'm going to go through each of the 50 states and discuss what I think the different possibilities are for that state. And then we can discuss on the states that are the most critical for the various candidates. Each state over here has the number of Electoral College votes underneath the state name. So let's start all the way up here in the northeast corner in the New England region of the country, New England and the Northeast. This is traditionally a very liberal area of the country. It is, based on the demographics that I mentioned before, would be the an area that's dominated by the coastal whites, by liberal coastal white area, people that are more academic, people that are more liberal in general, and there are a much smaller percentage of minority population than there are in many other areas of the country, but nevertheless this area has been a very, very strong Democratic area. First, let's start with the state all the way in the upper right hand corner over here, Maine. Maine is one of two states that actually split its electoral college votes. It does not necessarily go all for one candidate. What Maine does is the winner of the state gets two, and then the winner of each of the two congressional districts gets that particular district. Maine was historically a swing state, and it is a state with a lot of independence, or at least at some points it was historically a swing state, and it is a state with a lot of independence. It is a state that a Republican can win a statewide election. Its congresswomen are Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins, both Republicans, both moderate Republicans, but still both Republicans. Its governor, Paul LePage, is a Republican and not even necessarily a moderate Republican. So state Republicans can win Maine, but not recently in a presidential election. It's been a long time since Maine has actually been competitive on the presidential level, and there's really no reason to believe that that will be different this year. Maine, again, a very, very heavily white state. Very few few minorities in the state, but Maine typically will be much more of a liberal state than many other states in the country, and I don't think there's much chance of a Republican winning Maine this year. So I am going to put the state in blue. Now, Real Clear Politics allows you to distinguish between safe states and likely states. I'm not going to go into that much detail. What I'm going to do for each state is I'm going to give you five possibilities: a leaner for either direction, a likely for either direction, or a toss up. Now, when we get to our next state, we have our first toss up, and that is the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire, a very strongly independent state. Again, a state with a few minorities, a state that is dominated by working class whites and by the coastal whites, and also that has a very large percentage of independents. New Hampshire, of course, one of the most important states when it comes to the nomination process, as it always holds the first primary. Iowa holds the first caucus, and then New Hampshire holds the first primary. This year, of course, it went to Governor Mitt Romney, which helped him in the early going to secure some momentum that eventually allowed him to win the Republican nomination. New Hampshire is a swing state. In 2000, it went for then Governor Bush. In 2004, it swung to Kerry. In 2008, Obama won it fairly handily. I think he won it by about 14 or 15 points, which was significantly better than he did on a nationwide average. Nevertheless, New Hampshire is a state with its independence that is very, very malleable, that can go either way, and it's the sort of thing that it may even be too early to judge a state like New Hampshire. It could swing very heavily and go for Obama by double digits again, or it could be extremely competitive. I wouldn't even say it's leaning at this point. I'd call it pretty much a toss-up. Vermont, which is over here. That, of course, I'm going to put in Democrat red. Vermont is one of the most liberal states in the country. It has Bernie Sanders as one of his senators, who is quite proud to be one of the most liberal senators in the Senate. In fact, he's not even a Democrat; he's an independent because he feels that the Democratic Party is too right wing for him. And Vermont is certainly a Democrat state in this election, and it's hard to envision a scenario where it doesn't go Democratic, although of course it did go Republican in 1984 for Reagan, but that was a long time ago. Massachusetts, even though of course Massachusetts, Mitt Romney was governor of Massachusetts, and normally if you are from a state, that gives you a big advantage, and in fact Romney may actually do better in Massachusetts than an ordinary Republican would, but that's the good news. The bad news for Romney is that Republicans do so badly in Massachusetts that it's just not going to matter. Massachusetts is a safe Democratic state. There we go. Okay, the other New England states pretty much the same. Rhode Island, very liberal state, can elect a Republican, as it did with Link Chafee. Link Chafee is now the governor there. He's now an independent. He used to be a Republican, but still a very liberal state is not going to vote for Mitt Romney for president. Connecticut, a state also very similar to the rest of New England, a little bit of a higher minority population, which, will help the Democrats even a little bit more. Again, it is a state that Republicans can win in certain statewide elections. They've a Republican governors have been elected recently in Connecticut, and they have an independent senator in Joe Lieberman, who's now retiring. And Lieberman, of course, was a Democrat, but in presidential politics, Connecticut is a fairly reliable Democratic state and will be so this year again. You have New York. New York, now we get out of the New England region and into the Middle Atlantic region. New York used to be the single most important state in the country because, first of all, it used to have the most electoral college votes, although it's now been eclipsed by both Texas and California, and Florida has now tied it and will soon eclipse it. We'll probably eclipse it during the next census. But New York is still a very important state in terms of that it has a lot of electoral college votes, but it is no longer a swing state. Back in the old days, when the Democrats were a heavily Southern party, and Republicans were a party that had tremendous inroads in liberal areas. New York was considered a swing state, maybe in the middle part of the century and in the early part of the century. That, of course, is no more. New York is now a reliably Democratic state. It was actually one of the few states that voted for Michael Dukakis against George H.W. Bush. This year, it will not change. This year, of course, it will be reliably Democratic. Now we move into the Middle Atlantic region. The Middle Atlantic region is a region that certainly has a much higher minority population than the Northeast does, but still has its share of coastal liberals. It also has a significant number of working class people, especially as we get into the industrial areas in the upper Midwest. But here you could have still, it's getting more. This area of the country is getting more and more a Democratic stronghold, whereas it used to be more of a split area, or even some parts of it strongly Republican. But the Middle Atlantic states over here have become much stronger for Democrats in recent times. So let's take a look at some of the Middle Atlantic states. New Jersey. New Jersey is a state that, again, historically was actually a swing state in the middle part of the 20th century. It has leaned much more towards the Democratic side, and generally speaking, it is becoming much more difficult for Republicans to do well in New Jersey. In the 80s and 90s, it was still possible for Republicans to win nationwide elections in New Jersey. Now it is much, much more difficult. Presidential elections, New Jersey sometimes starts out as a swing state, but as you get closer, even in elections where Republicans win, New Jersey tends to swing heavily towards the Democratic side. There's no reason to think that this year will be different, so I will leave New Jersey in the President Barack Obama column. Delaware, a state that used to be a swing state, used to be a bellwether state. Before 2000, the first election of President George W. Bush, Delaware was considered one of the best bellwether states in the country. Not anymore, as with the rest of the Middle Atlantic region, it has shifted more towards a Democratic lean, and there's especially with Vice President Joe Biden being from Delaware, even that's probably not necessary. There's no reason to think that Delaware will be competitive. In fact, I will give it a President Barack Obama blue. Maryland, as we get a little bit further towards the south, so a little bit more culturally conservative. The further south you get, the more culturally conservative, and the less influence the quote unquote coastal liberal whites have on the state. But Maryland still does have its share of coastal liberal whites, especially being home to many of the suburbs of Washington D.C. It also has a very high African American population in many areas surrounding Washington D.C. and in Baltimore and places like that. Maryland recently has been reliably Democratic for pretty much all purposes, whether you're talking about the governorship or the Senate, and in presidential politics as well. There's no reason to believe that Maryland will be competitive. It stays in the Barack Obama column. Pennsylvania, a traditional swing state, a state that still can be a swing state, a state where Republicans and Democrats both have chances to win. Pennsylvania, a little bit more of a culturally conservative state than many other states in the Northeast. A state with a medium minority population in cities such as Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Certainly a large working class white population. An area where, because of that population, because of its membership in the quote unquote Rust Belt, heavy manufacturing areas, and also farm areas, as we're starting to get into the bigger states part of the country. Pennsylvania has traditionally been considered a swing state, and you don't even necessarily have to be a liberal Republican to win in Pennsylvania, as you do in most other in the rest of the Northeast. In order to win as a Republican, you have to be a pretty liberal Republican or a moderate Republican. In Pennsylvania, you can win as a conservative Republican, as was shown by Pat Toomey winning the Senate race there a couple of years back. And former Senator Rick Santorum before him. Santorum, of course, was the runner-up in the primary battle with Mitt Romney, and both of them, Toomey and Santorum, have reputations as being very conservative, especially culturally conservative Republicans. So a Republican can win in Pennsylvania. A candidate like Mitt Romney can win in Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania in recent presidential elections has swung heavily towards the Democratic side. But it is the sort of thing that definitely can still be a swing state. I will say right now it is leaning towards Obama. I would say if the election were held today, the odds are excellent that Obama would win the state. But if there is a little bit of a shift, if the economic numbers continue to be kind of mediocre or decrease, President Obama could have a little bit of a more difficult time in Pennsylvania. A state like Pennsylvania does have elements of Appalachia in it. Does depend on manufacturing to an above average extent, and it is a state that is susceptible to being a target for Republicans. But right now, you have to give President Obama the substantial edge in that state. Okay, now we move into areas where we have some more swing states, areas that are much more critical in the electoral math in the country. And we move further down in the Middle Atlantic region to the state of Virginia. Now, the state of Virginia historically was considered a southern state and a more conservative state. That's changed a little bit. Rather than being considered a southern state, Virginia is now more looked at as a middle Atlantic state and a little bit of a swing state. Traditionally, in the last 40 or 50 years, Virginia has been a very strong Republican state, but that has changed. Virginia, for example, Jim Webb won the senatorial election, a Democratic candidate, over George Allen in 2006. President Obama easily captured Virginia in the 2008 election. Tim Kaine, a Democratic governor, held the governor's mansion for a while, but that swung back a little bit. In 2010, the Republicans were able to recapture the governor's mansion and able to win a few key House of Representatives seats. Virginia has all the characteristics, if you look at it over the last 5 or 10 years, of being a swing state. Virginia being a state that is a swing state not necessarily because it has many independent voters like New Hampshire, but because it has very strong blocks of independent, I'm sorry, excuse me, very strong blocks of partisan voters for each side. Certainly, Virginia is home to many minorities, and I guess the uh, coastal whites who would tend to side with the Democratic Party, but it also has a significant element of southern whites who would generally tend to side with the Republican Party. Virginia really is a classic swing state, according to Nate Silver's most recent analysis. Virginia, excuse me, has the single greatest chance of any state of being the tipping point state. Tipping point state is the state upon which you win or lose the election, the one that delivers the winning candidate the 270th Electoral College vote. If it's a tipping point state in a relatively close election, there's really no way you can call Virginia anything other than a toss-up. So I will leave it over here. Now let's move down the coast a little. Oh, actually, you know what? Let's move to this region of the country. Let's move to the quote unquote Rust Belt, the upper Midwest over here. First, we're going to start in Appalachia, in a state like West Virginia. West Virginia is a state that historically was a very strong Democratic candidate. It was a very strong Democratic side. President Clinton won West Virginia twice. Michael Dukakis won West Virginia in 1988, one of the few states he actually did win. Recently, West Virginia has shifted very strongly towards the Republican candidate. West Virginia is very heavily working class white territory and quote unquote southern white territory as well. President Obama has had enormous trouble in West Virginia in various contexts. He lost West Virginia big in 2008. He even lost the primary to Hillary Clinton in 2008 by a very wide margin. There's no reason to think that West Virginia will be close. I will put West Virginia in the Romney column. Same basic analysis with Kentucky, also an Appalachian state, also a state with a strong working class white population, but a state that President Obama has not been competitive in, again, either in presidential politics or in the primary politics in 2008. Kentucky will cast its electoral college votes for Romney. Now we get to the state of Ohio. Ohio is almost certainly the number one bellwether state in the country now. Virginia may be the most likely tipping point state, but Ohio is still the great bellwether. Ohio has the longest streak in the country of having cast its electoral college votes for the winner. It has not cast its electoral college votes for the loser of a presidential election since 1960, when it cast its ballots for Richard Nixon against John F. Kennedy. Missouri used to hold that streak, but that was broken up in 2008. Now Ohio has the streak. Ohio is the classic swing state. Ohio has a fairly representative minority population. It is dominated by working class whites, a typical swing constituency. It's a state where the economy matters a lot. It's a state where there's a lot of manufacturing jobs, a state where economic growth and economic malaise tends to affect the people dramatically. And it's a state that in 2004, of course, was the last state to be called and the state that was the tipping point to give then President Bush re-election. It's a state that can only be considered a swing state. The latest polls show President Obama with a very, very slight edge, but it is very, very difficult to say who will win Ohio. Essentially, if one party does well in the country, that candidate will win Ohio. If it is an extremely close race, the winner of Ohio stands a very, very good chance to win the election. Indiana. Indiana is a state that, as I discussed before, President Obama was able to poach from the normally reliable Republican hands. Indiana, a very heavily white working class state, a state that does have a significant minority population, mostly in the Chicago area in the northwest part of the state. It was that area of the state that was able to tip Indiana for President Obama in 2008. However, in close elections, Indiana typically swings heavily towards the Republican side. President Bush Sr. in 1992, even though he lost the election significantly, was able to win Indiana. Bob Dole won Indiana against Clinton. President George W. Bush won Indiana twice relatively easily. Indiana, if you look at the polls and you look at the demographics and you look at the fundamentals, should probably lean towards the Republican side. I'm going to call it lean Romney. If Obama wins Indiana, or if Obama is close in Indiana, it means he will win the election big, as he did in 2008. Michigan. Michigan was once considered, not that long ago, the single most important swing state of any state in the country. Michigan has the demographics that would indicate that it would be a swing state. Large working class white population, a large African American population in the Detroit area, and because the former demographic has become more of a swing demographic, and of course, African American population has swung so heavily towards the Democratic side, with President Obama being in the White House, Michigan has tended to lean much more towards the Democratic side. That does not mean that a Republican can't win Michigan. The Republicans were able to win the governor's mansion in Michigan in 2010, and certainly the fact that Mitt Romney is originally from Michigan and his father was a popular politician in Michigan may help him. But right now, if you look at the polling, you still have to say that President Obama has the advantage. I will call it leaning Obama. Although Michigan is a state that if Romney does well in, if Romney has significant advantage, it is a state that could swing based on the economy. Because, of course, of Detroit and the auto manufacturing companies, it is the sort of state that is highly susceptible to economic indicators. It can become in play. I don't know if it's quite in play yet. Wisconsin. Wisconsin has the reputation of being more of a bluish state, but that reputation might not necessarily be so deserved. In 2004, in the Bush-Kerry election, people don't realize this because everything was focused on Ohio, the single closest state in the country was Wisconsin. Wisconsin was decided eventually in favor of John Kerry, but only by much less than 1%. Wisconsin very, very nearly was carried by President George W. Bush. Wisconsin saw the election of a Tea Party Republican in Ron Johnson for the Senate in 2010, saw the election of a conservative economic Republican in Scott Walker, and just recently, with the recall election, reaffirmed the election of Scott Walker. Just a couple of weeks ago, really, just last week actually, and that is something that has many Democrats worried about the fact that Walker's election was by a fairly significant margin, and the fact that Wisconsin has shown a tendency, or a possibility at least, of electing fairly conservative Republicans. Based on those factors, it is certainly possible that Romney could be competitive in Wisconsin. President Obama does have the lead in the polls there, and he did win fairly comfortably in 2008. Nevertheless, based on the fact that Ron Johnson and Scott Walker have been elected by Wisconsin, and based on its tradition of being fairly close in presidential elections that have been close, like in 2004, I don't think that you can say that Wisconsin is necessarily in either column right now. I think I would leave it as a swing state. Illinois. Illinois is a state that, again, once was a swing state, like New York and New Jersey in the middle of the 20th century was a swing state. No more. It has been reliably Democratic in the recent past. President Obama, of course, hails from Chicago. There's very little question that President Obama will win Illinois. And finally, we'll go to Minnesota before we move to the south. Well, actually, let's do these three states before we move to the south. Minnesota. Minnesota sometimes early in the election is called a swing state. Polling is a little erratic in Minnesota. You will see some outlier polls in Minnesota, but in the end, Minnesota almost always swings toward the Democratic side. Not necessarily in other statewide elections. Certainly, the election of Norm Coleman in 2002, after the death of Paul Wellstone, and when he was running against Walter Mondale, was a shock to the Democrats. But in presidential politics, Minnesota typically swings towards the Democratic side late in the political season. President Obama won it comfortably in 2008, and there's really no reason to believe that he will not again win it comfortably in 2012. Iowa. Iowa, a state that also has been considered a swing state in the recent past. It was one of only three states to split its electoral college votes between 2000 and 2004, 2000 going for Vice President Gore and 2004 for President Bush. President Obama's first major victory came in Iowa in 2008 when he won the Iowa caucuses over Hillary Clinton, jumpstarting his campaign and march to the White House that, of course, eventually culminated in him being elected to the White House. Iowa polling shows President Obama with a fairly substantial advantage. Iowa definitely is considered a swing state, but President Obama definitely has the edge there for the time being, and I would have to list it as leaning Obama. Now we get to Missouri. Missouri, until 2008, had the status of the most long-running bellwether state. From 1956, or starting really in 1960, through 2004, Missouri cast its electoral college votes for the winner of every presidential election. That changed in 2008 when John McCain won it narrowly and nevertheless lost the White House. Missouri has been tilting a little bit more Republican in recent times. Missouri is almost your classic microcosm of the United States, and really that's why it's a swing state. It has minority populations in St. Louis and Kansas City. It has southern constituency in the southern part of the state. The northern part of the state is more of, the northeast part of the state shares borders with Illinois and shares culture with Illinois. The western part of the state may be more of a plains mountain region, Great Plains region of the country. The southern part of the Missouri, especially as you get down toward the Ozarks and the Arkansas and Tennessee borders, it gets a little bit more of a southern state. I believe the actual midpoint in the United States in terms of population is somewhere in Missouri. It's really emblematic of the fact that Missouri is sometimes referred to as a microcosm of the United States. Missouri has tilted a little bit more Republican, and of course, casting its electoral votes for John McCain in spite of President Obama's comfortable win, and in the decisive victory in 2010 of Roy Blunt in the Senate campaign. So while Missouri has been a swing state, has been a bellwether state, you have to say that right now, based on the trend of Missouri, you have to say that Missouri leans towards Romney. If Missouri is one of those states that if Missouri is really a toss-up, if Missouri is very, very close, it probably means that President Obama has won re-election. If it is a very, very close election, a knife's edge election that is unsure right up until Election Day, that probably means that Romney will win Missouri. Now we're going to move into the South region of the United States. Now you can see so far we have President Obama with a big lead, including likely and leaning states. We have President Obama at 157 and Romney at 34, but that of course will change as we get towards the southern part of the country. And let's start first with North Carolina. This is one of those states again that can be a swing state and was a swing state in 2008. Because of the fact that it has a large minority population and a growing urban population in general. But other than that, it is a southern state, of course, and it's a state that historically was pretty safe on the Republican side, and it's a state that if the Republicans win, or if the Republicans are competitive, if it's a very, very close election, the Republicans really have to win North Carolina. There's really no way for the Republicans to be even to not win North Carolina handily and still win the presidential election. So the early polling is actually pretty close, but the demographics and the tradition of North Carolina would indicate that you're probably looking towards a lean Romney state in the event that the election is very close. So right now I'd have to give North Carolina a lean Romney designation. By the way, I forgot to do District of Columbia over here. District of Columbia is it's one of the few states or one of the few areas that can be predicted with absolute certainty. District of Columbia will probably give President Obama about 90% of its votes, so we can just put that in the Obama column without too much discussion. Now let's take a look at the rest of the South. South Carolina, I have seen some polls recently that have been fairly close, but it's a state that is rarely competitive, and it's a state, in spite of a large African American population, very, very unlikely to be very competitive. We will put it in the Romney column. Georgia. Georgia is a state that President Obama was competitive in 2008. It does have a large African American population. Other than that, of course, being a southern state. But in order for a Democrat like President Obama to be competitive in Georgia, that means that you have to be very, very strong elsewhere. In a close election, Georgia will not be competitive. I will designate the state as leaning Romney. I can't say safe Romney yet. I can't say likely Romney yet because it was fairly competitive in 2008. It is possible for President Obama to make a strong effort there, but it is probably pretty unlikely, assuming that the election is close. Florida. Florida has the reputation of being the bellwether state, the tipping point state, because that's what it was in the most famous close election of all, and that was, of course, 2000, when Florida was decided by less than 600 votes, eventually tipping the election in favor of then Governor George W. Bush. Florida's demographics, we have kind of an upside down state. In the southern part of the state, you have many transplanted northerners and you have many Latinos. You have immigrants from Cuba and other areas of the Caribbean. In the northern part of Florida, you have more of the uh, areas that are more comparable to Georgia and Alabama as you get closer to the Georgia and Alabama borders. Because of the northern aspect of Florida and because of the fact that Cuban voters tend to sympathize more with Republicans because of their stronger stance on Cuba or against Cuba, against the Castro regime, Florida has tended to be slightly more towards the Republican side than the nation as a whole. That was true for every recent election. In 2000, of course, Gore won the popular vote by a small amount, and Florida went for a very, very small amount for Bush. In 2004, when Bush won the popular vote by 3 points, he won Florida by about 5 points. And in 2008, when Obama won the national vote by about 7 points, he only won Florida by, I forget the exact number, but by significantly less than that. It was less than that. So Florida is a state in which a conservative Republican does have a strong chance. It's a state in which Romney probably has to win in order to win the election. It's very, very difficult to imagine Romney losing Florida and winning the election. Nevertheless, I don't think that you can put Florida in Romney's column yet. I think you just have to leave Florida as a swing state. Probably not a tipping point state. Probably slightly more towards the Republican side than most other state than the average state, but a state that it is very difficult to discount President Obama's chances of winning there. The other southern states, on the other hand, are a little bit easier. The other southern states, many of them do have strong minority populations, but that's not enough. Usually the evangelical white population is very, very dominant in these areas, and most of these states are pretty much non-competitive. A state like Alabama, safe. In Romney's column, same for Mississippi. Tennessee, I have had seen some recent polls that have actually had the margin between President Obama and Governor Romney under 5 points in some polls, under 10 points in most polls, but that's probably statistical noise. It's very unlikely that Tennessee will be extremely competitive. Of course, Vice President Gore lost Tennessee in 2000, even though he was from Tennessee. Even though he was elected to Senate from Tennessee, Tennessee is probably a very strong Republican state this year as well, and I will put it in Romney's column. Arkansas, same basic idea. President Clinton, of course, was able to win Arkansas and some of the other southern states. That is probably not true with President Obama. It was kind of competitive in some polls in 2008. It didn't really turn out to be competitive in the general election. I will put Arkansas in the column of Governor Romney. Louisiana, the same. I don't really see President Obama being competitive there either, for the same reasons, and we will put that in Governor Romney's column. Now, of course, you can see the vote getting a little bit closer. We have 160 for Obama, 114 for Romney. Now we move into the Plains region. The Plains region where we have a very where we have small population states and we have very strong Republican stronghold states. In this area of the country, the dead center of the country from a geographic perspective, Democrats have really been non-competitive there in several election cycles. Even on the senatorial side, we have had Democrats suffer there dramatically in recent years, as Democratic statewide office holders have retired or been uh, unelected. In South Dakota, where John Thune beat then Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. North Dakota, where a formerly Democratic held seat was won by Republican John Hoeven by a really big margin. And basically, in these areas, Democrats have traditionally been able to win them, but if you are a Democratic incumbent in those areas, or if you have a Democratic incumbent in those areas, the Democratic Party is well advised to keep them running, because when they retire, typically they're replaced by Republicans. This area, generally speaking, has shifted heavily towards the Republican side. North Dakota, safe Republican. Doesn't really. Well, actually, North Dakota is one of the few states that there's a possibility of shifting. North Dakota was somewhat competitive in 2008. People didn't pay that much attention to it because it's only 3 electoral votes. But in a close race, as we're expecting for this time around, North Dakota will be pretty safe in the Republican column. South Dakota looks like a strong, very, very strong pickup opportunity in the Senate for the Republicans. Also, there's very little chance that President Obama will be very competitive in that state. Nebraska is the other state that splits its ballot. In fact, President Obama was able to capture one of the electoral votes from Nebraska. That was there are 3 congressional districts in Nebraska, and one of them is around the city of Omaha. And President Obama was actually able to win that one, and split the Nebraska vote. It's possible that President Obama could be competitive in Omaha again. It only means 1 electoral vote. The rest of the state was pretty certain to go for Governor Romney, so we will put it in Romney's column. Kansas and Oklahoma, same basic idea. Very, very difficult for a Democrat to be competitive in those areas. We will list them both as likely Romney. Now we get to Texas. Texas has a very large Latino population, which, if the Latino population swings very strongly towards the Obama side, as it might, certainly based on the immigration debate, the Democrats have gotten the better of it with regard to the Latino population in recent years. Nevertheless, Texas does have a very strong white evangelical population, which leans very strongly in favor of the Republicans. Although it's possible for Texas to be competitive, and certainly in future elections, as the Latino population grows in Texas, Texas could become more and more competitive. The Democrats have been pretty much non-competitive recently in statewide elections, including presidential elections, and really there's no reason to believe that President Obama will be ultra-competitive in Texas. We will give Texas and its 38 electoral college votes to Mitt Romney. And now, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, Romney has taken the lead. But that lead might be a little bit short-lived as we move into the Southwest. But first, before we go to the Southwest, let's take care of Big Sky country over here in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Very small states, with Montana and Wyoming having the minimum number of electoral votes. Montana was actually very competitive in 2008. Montana has a lot of independent voters. Montana prides itself in being independent. There aren't that many people there, so I guess what few people there are can be independent. Montana was competitive, although McCain did end up winning the state. Montana did elect a Democrat to the Senate in John Tester back in 2006. But Montana still generally leans Republican. In a close race, Montana will be pretty safe Republican, and I'm going to change it to likely Romney. Wyoming is rarely competitive. We're going to use it as likely Romney. Idaho is pretty much non competitive as well. It will be likely Romney. Now we go to the Southwest, not quite the Pacific coast, but let's look at these five states, the Southwest states in Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. This is a region in general that has a high Latino population. It is also a region that has a much stronger Mormon population than many. It also is a region that is growing in population. It's a region that used to be virtually empty not that long ago, but because of really good weather, low humidity, warm winters, at least in Arizona and New Mexico, it is growing in population. So let's take a look at these states. Also a very swing region of the country. Like the upper Midwest over here, it is really the country's other swing region. Colorado. Colorado, a strong tipping point state, right smack dab in the middle. President Bush won it twice in 2000 and 2004, both very close elections. President Obama carried Colorado in 2008. Colorado, the polling has been pretty much right down the middle, giving President Obama a slight edge because he has the slight edge, generally speaking, in the polling. Colorado is a state that can be right down the middle in terms of where the country is. Wherever the popular vote in the country is, you can imagine that the popular vote in Colorado will be very similar to that. It is a classic swing state. Utah, pretty much non-competitive. Obviously, Governor Romney's the fact that he is a Mormon will help him in Utah. Utah probably wouldn't be competitive anyway. We will give it to likely Romney. Nevada. Nevada is a state that broke very strongly for the Democrats in 2008. Originally, President Bush won it twice. It would look to be a swing state. And it broke, I believe President Obama won it by double digits. And it has a slight lead in the polling this time, but you still have to call it a swing state as of right now. I don't think that you can put it in President Obama's column. If President Obama wins the election, he'll probably win Nevada as well, but there's no real, in a very, very close election, in a toss-up election, you have to look at Nevada as being a swing state. Nevada, as well, Las Vegas, of course, being the more democratically oriented part of the state and the southern part of the state, the rest of the state being slightly more Republican leaning. Nevada has a very large Mormon population. People don't realize that. They think it's only Utah, but Nevada also has a very strong Mormon population, and that could definitely help Governor Romney. Based on that, I don't think that you can necessarily put Nevada in either column right now. New Mexico is a swing state but has shifted very heavily towards Democrats in recent years. President Bush did win the state in 2004, although he lost it in 2000, but President Obama won it easily in 2008, and in the fact that New Mexico has two Democratic senators. Although they did elect a Republican governor in 2010, which shows that Republicans still can do well in New Mexico. Nevertheless, New Mexico, with its very high Latino population and its low population in very other areas, and Latinos although it's much more it is fairly competitive, do tend to lean toward the Democratic side, and that has given the Democrats the edge in New Mexico. It's no guarantee, but right now I would have to call New Mexico leaning Obama. Arizona. Arizona was won by John McCain, fairly handily, even though I think he won by 9 or 10 points in Arizona, which means that Arizona was about 16 or 17 points more towards the Republican than the national average, or than the nation, but that a lot of that might have had to do with the fact that John McCain was from Arizona. This time around, Arizona could be a little bit more targetable for the Democratic side, for President Obama. Again, a high Latino population, and a state that, while culturally very much a red state, does have a lot of the demographic characteristics that could make it a swing state. I would still have to call Arizona leaning Romney, but I certainly do not think that it is safe by any stretch of the imagination. If President Obama does very well among Latino voters, if President Obama does very well in the Southwest, you will see Arizona be much more competitive. Now we can look at the Pacific region. Washington, again, a little bit of a swing state 20, 30 years ago, not so much anymore. Washington, on most levels, on the levels of Senate and the governorship, presidential politics, has become much more Democratic leaning in the last few decades. There's no reason to believe that Washington will be competitive. Oregon, on the other hand, may be a little different. Oregon, along the I-5 corridor that goes somewhere up like this, through Portland, Eugene, some of the other cities over here, very heavily leaning Democratic. Other parts of the state, much more heavily Republican. However, recently what that has meant is that Oregon has voted Democratic in most of the recent elections for things like the Senate, the governorship. They've been competitive. Certainly, Gordon Smith was competitive in 2008 in spite of a very strong Democratic year. But Oregon is a state that can be competitive because of the fact that a significant percentage of the population of Oregon is in the Big Sky country over here in the eastern part of the state. Certainly, areas like Portland are very heavily coastal, in the coastal liberal section, the coastal liberal stronghold. In the Ectopia region, I forget who it was, somebody wrote a book dividing the U.S. into various countries, and the Northwest, and including parts of California, liberal area on the West Coast would include Portland and many of the other cities near the in the western part of the state. But Oregon is a state that has been strongly Democratic, but still is within reach of Governor Romney. I will call it leaning Obama. California is a state that used to actually be very strongly Republican, interestingly. In the middle part of the country, and sorry, in the middle part of the 20th century, California was pretty reliably Republican. It became a swing state probably in the 70s and 80s, and by now it is leaning very heavily towards the Democratic side. You have the coastal liberals, you have a minority population, you have a strong Latino population, and all those factors combined, a very low evangelical Christian population, all these factors combined make for a very strong Democratic stronghold, and so we will give California to President Obama. Alaska and Hawaii are pretty easy. Alaska, although it has voted in, or at least Democrats have been certainly very competitive over there, with the win of the Senate of Ted Stevens' Senate seat. It's escaping me who won it, but with the winning of Ted Stevens' old Senate seat in 2008, still, from a matter of presidential politics, it's very unlikely that the Democrats can win that state. We will give that to Romney. Hawaii, of course, the birthplace of President Obama, was completely non-competitive in 2008, although Hawaii was competitive in 2004. In fact, President Bush came pretty close to winning it. I think it was 3 or 4 points, but it was not competitive in 2008. It is not going to be competitive in 2012 either. So, overall, in our map, if you include leaners and likely states, we have 243 electoral college votes for President Obama. We have 206 electoral college votes for Governor Romney. And the rest, of course, are the swing states. And there are a tremendous variety of scenarios that could occur from either in these states. Obviously, it's possible for literally any of these combinations to be true. But so if we assume that the most important states in terms of being focused on by the candidates are states like New Hampshire, Virginia, Ohio, Florida, Wisconsin, Colorado, and Nevada, and the other states, the leaning states, the candidates will focus on a little bit, states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Indiana, Missouri, Arizona, Iowa, New Mexico. These states, the candidates will focus on a little bit, but I think that the candidates, certainly the people that work for the candidates, probably know that these states are very unlikely to be tipping point states. If we took out the leaners and we tried to focus a little bit more precisely on the real tipping point states and the tipping point states that let's take it a step further and let's give leaning status. I think all of the gray states are definitely swing states and could go either way, but let's try to focus it a little bit more on the really key states, on the real tipping point states that have a real chance to determine the election. If you do that, I think you'd have to put Florida in the Romney camp, a column. I think in a very, very close election, Romney would win Florida. I think Nevada probably goes to Obama in a very, very close election. Same thing with New Hampshire, and probably the same thing with Wisconsin as well. And that gives Obama 263, which means we've got three left. We've got Colorado, we've got Ohio, and we've got Virginia. And at least according to my analysis here, Romney's got to win all of them. Because if Obama takes one more state, that puts him over the top at 270. So really, basically what I'm saying is that I think it comes down to those three states: Colorado, Ohio, and Virginia, Romney has to win all three states. If Romney takes two out of those three states, he will lose a heartbreakingly close election. If he wins all three states, well, then President Obama will lose a heartbreakingly close election. So look to see those three states be the focus and the target of a lot of candidates' message. Not only will those three states be blitzed by advertising, you may even see the message of the candidates focus on issues that are important to those states. You may see them focus on manufacturing jobs that are important to Ohio. You may talk about environmental issues that may be particularly important to people in Colorado, etc. So I think those are some of the states you want to look at in terms of maybe the most important polling data may come from those states. But of course there are other states like Pennsylvania, states like Nevada, that could definitely be considered in play, even in a very, very, very close election. So, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. This is Stephen Haas for National Paralegal College. Have a wonderful day, everybody.